Hello everybody, welcome to another music theory video. This is David Farrell. In this video we're going to be talking about a brand new topic, modulation. We're going to be going over the basics of modulation and talking about a particularly common technique, the common chord modulation. Lots of information to cover, and so we're going to begin immediately. Let's begin, as we do many times, with some vocabulary. Tonicization is a term that's familiar to us, and if it's not familiar to you, maybe go back and watch some of the videos on secondary chords to catch up with it. A tonicization is a momentary borrowing of a harmony from another key area, usually from the key area of another diatonic triad. A modulation is a little bit different. In a tonicization, we pretend that a different diatonic triad is the tonic just for a short moment, but a modulation represents a larger scale musical shift to a new tonal center. We tend to lose that original tonic and establish a new tonic, a new key in which the music proceeds for a reasonable amount of time. Okay? The biggest difference between a tonicization and a modulation is the amount of emphasis on the new key center. A tonicization tends to have a very short and fleeting moment of emphasis, whereas a modulation tends to have a more sustained and longer period of emphasizing this new key center. Now, of course, there's a middle ground, and I want to point this out. Sometimes the difference is not clear. Sometimes we have a couple measures where we say, well, is this long enough to be a modulation? Feels a little bit too long to be a tonicization? Sometimes it's okay to have different ideas, and sometimes people will disagree on ambiguous examples. That's okay. Sometimes there's more than one way to look at a piece of music. One other term I'm going to introduce here is the idea of a change of mode. You notice that I say a modulation involves a musical shift to a new tonal center. When we change from a major key to its parallel minor key, like from C major to C minor, or vice versa, from C minor to C major, we technically don't consider this a modulation since the tonic doesn't change. The pitch C is still our tonic. Instead, we simply call this a change of mode. We change from the major mode to the minor mode rather than changing our entire tonal center. And so a little technicality there, but one we'll keep in mind as we look at music. Since this video is talking about changing between different keys, now is a good time to talk about key relationships, how we describe the relationships between different keys. Some of these are very old to you, but some are new. We remember relative keys from early on learning key signatures. Relative keys have the same key signature. B flat major and G minor both have the key signature of two flats. They're relative keys. E minor and G major both have the key signature of one sharp. They are relative keys. Parallel keys have the same tonic. This is also an idea you might be familiar with already. C major and C minor are parallel keys. E flat major and E flat minor are parallel keys. When we talk about modulation, we also talk about a new term for many of you, the idea of closely related keys. Closely related keys have key signatures that are within one accidental of each other. Okay? These are what we would call closely related keys. All the other keys are distantly related keys. Closely related keys, since they are only one accidental away, have a lot of pitches in common with one another, and this makes it easy to modulate from one of them to the other. Because there are so many similar notes, there's only a very subtle difference. Moving to a distantly related key is often a little bit jarring because there are so many different pitches between those keys. Let's look at what we mean when we talk about closely related keys with an example. I've chosen the key of D major as an example here. We know D major has two sharps, F sharp and C sharp. And here on the screen we can look at all the closely related keys, all the keys that we would describe as being closely related keys to D major. Of course, B minor has the same key signature. It is a closely related key to D major. It has two sharps, which is 0 sharps or 0 accidentals away from D major. Since we want to look for keys that are one accidental away, we can go in both directions. We can look at the keys that have one more sharp than D major. That includes A major, which has 3 sharps, and F sharp minor, which also has 3 sharps. We would also want to look in the other direction. G major has 1 sharp. It has 1 sharp fewer than D major, which has 2, which makes it a closely related key. And likewise, E minor has 1 sharp. Every key is going to have 5 keys which are closely related to it. It'll have its relative minor or major, and then the other keys that are within 1 accidental of it, okay? This is always going to be the case, and these are frequent targets for modulation. Modulation to closely related keys is very common. Okay, so we've talked about this business of modulation, of a substantial change in the tonal center of a piece of music. We compared it to our old idea of tonicization and introduced this tangent about change of mode. And we've talked a little bit about key relations. Now it's time to get into the actual business of how this happens in a piece of music. How do we get from one key to another key? How do we change our tonal center? Well, there's several different ways we find that composers employ to change the key in a piece of music. One of the most common is what we're going to be calling common chord modulation. This is a very frequently encountered way to get from one tonal center to another. As the name implies, common chord modulation uses a chord that is common to both keys as a transition from one another. It tries to find a chord that belongs both to the original key and the new key, and it uses this to sort of transition us from the one key to the other. This is the common chord. Sometimes you'll also hear it referred to as the pivot chord. Okay, it's the place on which we pivot from an initial key to a new key. Which chords we use can vary quite widely. There's a lot of different ways that we can use pivot chords and common chords. But what I will say is that oftentimes we'll use chords that have weaker or more ambiguous tonal functions, okay? Chords like the dominant in particular have a really, really strong function. And that dominance tends to make an awkward pivot chord. It really sounds particularly strongly in the original key, and so it doesn't really help us smoothly transition from one place to another. Weaker functioning chords, such as our predominant chords, 4 and 2, or chords like 3 and 6, are often found as pivot chords or as common chords because they have that weak function, and this allows them to sort of be a little bit ambiguous and allow us to slide over to a new key area. Well, I don't want to look at the common chords between every possible set of keys because that would be a little bit tiresome. I figured it would be good to look at one set of examples between 2 closely related major keys, the common chords between D major and G major. If I was composing a piece of music and I wanted to modulate from one of these keys to the other, it would be useful for me to know which chords belong to both scales. And so if I'm writing a piece of music, or if you have to write a piece of music, it's useful to look at what diatonic chords we find in both keys so that we can look for the similarities. Here, I've written down all my diatonic triads and I've starred the ones that appear in both keys. For example, D major appears in both keys. It's the 1 chord in the key of D, and it's the 5 chord in the key of G. E minor also appears in both keys. It's the 2 chord in the key of D, and it's the 6 chord in the key of G. F sharp minor appears in D major, but F sharp diminished appears in G major, and so neither of these would be useful as a common chord because they only belong to one key and not the other. G major is a common chord. It's 4 in our key of D and 1 in our key of G. A major is not a common chord, right? A major is the 5 of D, but we have A minor in the key of G major, and so the A chord is not going to be a really useful chord for us either. But B minor does appear in both keys. It's the 6 chord in D, and it's the 3 chord in G major. And finally, we have a C major triad in the key of G, but a C sharp triad, diminished triad in the key of D, and so these are not particularly useful when modulating either. So if we are writing music that moves between these two keys, or if we're looking to analyze a modulation that moves between these two keys. These are some of the chords we might encounter as common chords or pivot chords. Let's look at a short musical example so we can see how this information might be used in context. Here is a simple four-part phrase that I've written for us, and we're going to be talking about analyzing a modulating phrase here. The first step to analyzing a modulating phrase is the same as analyzing any piece of music. Listen to the music. Listen to the music. And let your ears help you. A lot of times we can hear a modulation or we can hear something happen in the music before we might be able to actually see it happen. Let's listen to a short realization here of the music. When analyzing a modulation, a couple of strategies are available to us. One is to try to find the point where chords no longer function in the original key. You can see I was able to label the first two measures of music here quite easily in the key of D major, a bunch of tonic and dominant chords and then a 2/6 chord. But after that I saw this chord in C major, a C major chord. And I know C major is not a diatonic chord in D major, and it's also pretty tricky to analyze it as a secondary chord in that key, as it would be tonicizing an F natural, which is not a diatonic place as well. So that raises an alarm for me. If you're unsure about where chords no longer function in the original key, because sometimes it's not as clear as it is here with this C major triad that shows up, another thing we might do is look for a cadence in a different key. Strong harmonic motion, a 5-1 in another key. And we do have that in this example. We have that at the end of the example. In the very last measure, we have a cadential 6-4 to a 5-7 to a 1 in the key of G major. We have a second inversion G major triad, and it resolves as we would expect it to do to a 5-7 chord, a D7 chord that resolves to a 1. Sometimes when I'm looking for a modulation, I know it happens somewhere and I have a hard time finding out exactly where. So I'll look for the cadence, I'll look for the thing that is very clear, and then I'll start to work my way backwards. Now that I know I have a cadence in my new key, a strong cadence in the key of G major, a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major, I can start working backwards and analyzing some of the other chords that it previously seemed odd to me in that new key. And so I'm going to look at that third measure no longer as a bunch of weird chords that don't fit into D major, but I'm going to see if I can analyze them in such a way that they fit into my key of G major. And in doing so, and in analyzing them in the key of G major, I see they actually make a lot more sense that way. All those C naturals don't do very good for me in D major, but in G major they work just fine. As a 4 chord moving to a 2 chord, moving to my 5, embellished by a cadential 6-4. I've added a new step now to my analysis. Once you've found that spot where the new key takes over, once you've found that spot where your chords are no longer functioning in the original key, but very clearly functioning in the new key, you want to actually go back one chord. You want to go back one chord. That chord is usually your pivot chord, and frequently it's the chord that you see right before you start seeing lots of accidentals in your new key. And so I can see that my last two measures are pretty cleanly in my key of G major, right? Those chords don't really have a lot of meaning in D major. That means my pivot chord is going to be just one chord behind. It's going to be the last chord of my second measure, and you can see I've labeled it with a star. It's that 2/6 chord in D major. This is the pivot. This is the common chord, the chord that belongs both to my old key, D major, and to my new key, G major, and it helps smoothly transition me from the key of D to the key of G. And so how shall I analyze this chord? I need to label it in such a way that I show its role as the pivot, as the common chord. And so I draw this little zigzag bracket, you can see it here, sort of a 3-line figure. And I label it in two different ways. I keep my 2-6 label from the key of D because that's the way it functions looking backwards to my old key. But underneath the 2-6, I give it a second label. It functions as a 6-6 in my new key looking forward in G major. And of course that 6 resolves to 4 and to 2 before resolving to 5 and to 1. And so the chord has a dual function. It serves to help smoothly transition me from the key of D to the key of G. And notice that in my composition, part of what made it effective was choosing a chord that has an ambiguous or weaker function. A 2 chord is not as strongly functioning as my dominant, and likewise a 6 chord in my new key is not a terribly strong functioning chord. This helped make my transition as smooth as possible. And so this is how we're going to be looking at common chord modulations. We always listen and let our ears help us. They often point us towards a new key, a new tonality. We try to find that point where the chords no longer function in the original key. We try to find that point where we just can't make any sense of the Roman numerals anymore. And if we're unsure about it, that's fine. We can skip ahead and find that cadence in a new key and then work our way backwards. Sometimes this makes analysis so much easier. I can't emphasize enough how much easier it gets once you know where you're going to land. And when we've found that point where we are clearly in the new key, we tend to go backwards one chord. And that chord is what we're going to be analyzing as the pivot, as the chord that helps us look both back to the old key and forward towards the new key. This is again a common technique, the common chord modulation. Thank you very much for watching. This is all we've got today. In this video, we reviewed the basics of what modulation is and means, and some of the basic ideas about key relations, the way we're going to be talking about modulation. And we got to look at one of the most common ways we find in music to switch from one tonal center to another, and that's the common chord modulation, using a chord that belongs to two different keys to give us a really smooth transition. We will be looking at other ways to modulate in the future. There are more ways to work with, but for now we're going to focus on this one. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.